Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Foster with the United States Agency for International Development, and welcome to today's webinar, Cybersecurity and Distributed Energy Resources, brought to you by the USAID partnership with the Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and in collaboration with the United States Energy Association. Before we begin, I'll quickly go over some of the webinar features. You have two options for audio, either your computer on your telephone. If you use your computer, please select the microphone and the speaker option in the GoToWebinar audio pane. If you use your telephone, please select the telephone option in the GoToWebinar audio pane, and then use the telephone number and audio pin to the right side of the display. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar's help desk by dialing the number on this slide. If you have any questions, please type them in the GoToWebinar questions pane anytime during the webinar. We will share a recording of the presentation within a few days via email and on the USAID NREL Partnership Learning Channel playlist on YouTube at the link provided here. There you can find other informative resources from the USAID NREL Partnership. The USAID and NREL partner to deliver clean, reliable, and affordable power to the developing world. The USAID NREL partnership addresses critical aspects of deploying energy systems in developing countries through policy, planning, and development support, as well as global technical platforms. The USAID NREL partnership's global technical platforms provide free, state-of-the-art support on critical challenges to scaling up advanced energy systems. These platforms include the Renewable Energy Explorer, Greening the Grid, the International Jobs and Economic Development IJEDI model, and the Resilient Energy Platform. The Resilient Energy Platform provides expertly curated resources, training materials, tools, and technical assistance to enhance power sector resilience. The platform enables decision makers to assess power sector vulnerabilities, identify resilient solutions, and make informed decisions to enhance power sector resilience at all scales. More information can be found on the website shown here. Finally, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. I'm Jeremy Foster, a Senior Energy Advisor with USAID. Maurice Martin, Senior Cybersecurity Research Leader from NREL, will lead our main presentation. Tammy Reynolds, Cybersecurity and Resilience Business Development Lead at NREL. Curly Henry, Executive Director, Cybersecurity Strategy and Architecture at Southern Company. And James Elworth, a Research Engineer from NREL, will moderate the Q&A session. With that said, I will hand it over to Maurice and Tammy.
Thank you. This is Maurice Martin, and I'm just going to, before I leap into my presentation, introduce myself and have my co-presenter, Tammy Reynolds, introduce herself. I've been with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory for about 5 years now and have about 12 years experience in technology research for the electric utility industry. My work these days focuses primarily on security architectures for complex systems, but I came from an organization here in the US that is focused on the small rural electric co-ops that serve a lot of the land mass of the United States. And in that work, I became interested in helping small utilities that are just beginning their journey towards improved security. And I've kept that interest during my time at NREL. And I believe that there's a lot of great work that can be done working with utilities who are at that stage in their security journey. And so that's kind of what drove me to embrace the work that the USAID is doing in helping utilities in that way. So very happy to be here, very happy to be working with USAID and to be in contact with all of you. Tammy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Maurice. Hi, everyone. My name is Tammy Reynolds, and I am also with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I have been at NREL for 6 years, and I currently lead most of all of the effort that we do for cybersecurity assessment work. And I've led a team for the last couple of years, which I will go into detail here in a few minutes, about the Distributed Energy Resource Cybersecurity Framework. And so that's basically been my role, mostly amongst many other things on the team, but just really excited to be able to present to you today our new tool, the Dursa, and be able to explain details about the tool. Thank you.
So today's focus is cybersecurity for distributed energy resources, and wanted to start with just a discussion about what we mean when we say distributed energy resources. Quick answer is solar, wind, and other renewable resources. Think solar panels on top of office buildings and homes. Electric cars can be considered DERs, batteries. The formal definition, there are actually a lot of them, but one that is very popular comes from the IEEE 1547 document, which says that it is an electric power source that is not connected to the bulk power system. In other words, resources that are things that generate or store electricity that are connected to the distribution grid rather than the transmission grid. And even though we tend to think of them as renewable resources, and certainly, given NREL's mission, that's something that we focus on a lot, it's actually not limited to renewables. Fossil fuels can be distributed energy resources if they are connected at the distribution level. So you have things like biogas, diesel gensets, natural gas gensets, things like that. And as I said, certainly the kind of storage batteries that we're seeing being deployed more and more fall into that category as well. So there's a lot of different technologies, but kind of the defining factor is how they touch the grid and how they interact with the grid. Generally, traditionally, I should say, they have been connected without necessarily a communication or a control pathway back to the utility, but that's changing as more and more of these come online and become part of the generation mix of the grid. We're going to see more communications between these devices and the utility, and that, as we'll see, presents some challenges for cybersecurity. Are controllable loads and demand response part of DERs? Depends on who you ask. IEEE says no, but certainly other sources would put demand response within the domain of DER, and particularly Navigant Research does and publishes a lot of research about DERs, and they tend to lump demand response in there as well. So kind of an open question. DERs have a kind of a interesting role to play in developing countries. They can fill the gaps that might otherwise exist in those areas. If you think about isolated rural areas that may not have transmission and distribution infrastructure built out yet, you can deploy solar panels and small wind facilities and provide some power to those areas. So that has driven their uptake in some developing nations over the years. Also, some nations may have trouble with their fossil fuel supply. It may be subject to disruptions from conflict, or it may be that fossil fuels are just expensive, and that's certainly a challenge for island nations. And like everyone else, environmental concerns play a factor. So all of these things rolled up have driven market growth for DERs in developing countries, particularly the ones listed there. And fun fact, the nation that is leading solar power installations per capita is actually Kenya. They have also been a trailblazer in terms of the use of geothermal power on the African continent. So A lot of people might have guessed Germany, but it's actually Kenya that holds that particular distinction. So what are the DER security concerns, given that there are so many advantages to DERs and they provide so much flexibility in terms of diversifying your generation portfolio, but they come with some concerns that have to be planned for and addressed. And one is the increased attack surface. And this is applicable to DERs that, as I said, have some communication link back to the utility, that have some kind of a command and control structure in place to help manage them and help so that the DERs are contributing to the stabilization of the grid. But once you make that connection, you have increased the attack surface of the entire system. And what that means is that there are just more devices to attack. Whereas before, your utility control network was very contained and possibly even, you had some established perimeter around your utility network. Now you've got devices on office buildings, on out at wind farms in remote areas, and there's just more things that a determined attacker could target in terms of trying to compromise the system. Misoperation of resources to disrupt the grid, because DERs are cyber-physical devices, meaning that they are controlled by computers, but they affect things in the real world. And if you can misoperate them, you can inject voltages or frequency changes to the grid and disrupt grid operations. Now, the thing about that is you would have to compromise a large number of these devices to have a significant impact. If I were a hacker and I went after one solar panel on someone's house, I'm really not going to be able to do that much mischief. But if I can somehow compromise 100, 1,000, 10,000 solar panels, then I begin to have the ability to do more malicious activity. There are ways to do that. One way is to compromise a utility control network, and another way is through the vendor. A lot of these devices operate sophisticated software that help them maximize their output, contribute to grid stability, etc. And that software is updated periodically by the vendor of those devices. They will push out updates, much as you get updates on the operating system of your computer. So if a hacker can get into the update server at the vendor and inject malware at that point, then it gets pushed out to all these devices in the field and could be used to do some kind of broad-based manipulation of DERs. Now, that's kind of speculative because on one hand, we've seen that kind of software, firmware updating attack in other domains. In the personal computer realm, there have been cases where update servers have been compromised, but we haven't seen it specifically in the energy sector. But that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. It just means that it hasn't happened yet. And so when you think about security, that's something that you want to think about and make sure you're factoring into your security planning. Upstream attack, and that's another term of art in the security field. And what it means is that the cyber attackers are moving from device to device in a way that is opposite of what you normally think of as in the normally attack path. If you could imagine the utility control network device here at the top of that diagram, normally that would be connected to the enterprise network. That's the office network at a utility that handles email and billing and things like that. The way you normally expect an attack to happen is that it comes in either through compromised device on the enterprise network, or someone clicks on an email with a malicious attachment. The enterprise network gets infected, and that moves to the utility control network. and then possibly results in manipulation of devices on the grid edge. And that's that's a very common attack path, but because we now have all these devices on the grid edge, it's possible for an attack to go the other way. In other words, it starts at the grid edge and goes back up to the utility network. Haven't seen that, but it's been done as a proof of concept, and certainly we've seen a lot of in the Internet of Things domain. We've seen cases where devices were compromised and attacked each other and became part of control networks that resulted in doing denial of service attacks. And so it's theoretically possible, we just haven't seen it happen yet. And then damage to equipment. Again, DERs are cyber-physical devices. They control things in the real world. And if you can do that, then you have the possibility of damaging things in the real world. So you can kind of imagine if the software on a battery inverter or the control system on a battery were compromised and caused the battery to cycle in ways that was destructive, you could have damage to the equipment. So all of these things have to be factored into DER security. And we have already seen an example of a renewable energy provider, someone who works with DER and provides power from DERs, hit by a cyber attack, and that was here in the United States, in Utah. The incident in question resulted in loss of communication between the office of the company, which is called S-Power, back to its field installations. And the root cause was a unpatched firewall, which is, as you know, firewalls are one of the most basic security controls. This one was not up to date in terms of the latest version of the software and was subject to an attack. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's not even clear that this particular energy provider was the target of the attack. It seems as though they might have been caught up in an attack that had another target, or one of these attacks that is just released into the internet to see what kind of mischief can be done. But nonetheless, because of the nature of their distributed system, they ended up being subject to the attack. So as you think about security for DERs, you want to at least have your target be that you will not be caught up in this kind of very basic directionless attack, that your system is hardened sufficiently so that you can that someone would really have to think about and get to know your system in order to do any damage. But this incident is kind of a first in a couple of ways. It's the first wind and solar company to be the victim of a cyber attack, and it's also the first time a U.S. grid operator is known to have lost connection to power generations due to a cyber attack. One thing to keep in mind is that cybersecurity for DERs is largely unregulated at this time. In other words, governments have not imposed a lot of cybersecurity regulations yet. That may be coming down the road, but so far it's kind of a free-for-all. Generally, regulations from governments tend to focus on the big equipment, the big generation facilities, the transmission facilities. And that's certainly true in the US, where our NREL standards form the basis for our regulatory framework. And NREL does not reach down to the level of these much smaller DER installations. So you end up with a situation where you've got all the possible consequences that we discussed earlier, but also the possibility of not being regulated. And that means that securing these devices is a matter of adhering to best practices. And things get a little complicated when you talk about DER best practices. Certainly you want to adhere to best practices for general cybersecurity and utilities, because this is part of the utility system. But DERs also have a lot in common with the Internet of Things, these distributed devices, each kind of acting as a trusted node on the network. And it's also part of the industrial control system that controls your grid. So you've got a lot of different best practices all coming together to help define DER cybersecurity. That's driven by the special nature of DERs. They're being cyber physical devices at remote locations and being, you would expect those remote locations to have weak physical security and be unsupervised. And if you're able to have physical access to a device, you're able to, hackers are often able to compromise the devices either by opening them up or even accessing USB ports on those devices. So DER security looked at it in this way can seem a little intimidating. You've got so many best practices, so many factors to take into account. Fortunately, though, we at NREL have done some work on making that job easier and kind of sifting through all of these different resources to find out what can really help an organization address cybersecurity for DERs. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tammy, who's going to tell us a little bit about that work and what it has produced. Tammy?
Thank you, Maurice. Yeah, thank you so much for kicking this off. And yes, we at NREL have done research on cybersecurity assessments. We feel that by doing assessments, it is a great baseline to get a really good idea of what the cybersecurity posture of either a utility or a federal site or a government a location, anybody that either plans to integrate DERs onto their system or has already integrated DERs onto their system. We feel that assessments are a key piece to being able to help identify gaps in cybersecurity posture and then be able to address those gaps. So research has definitely identified cybersecurity vulnerabilities in operational technology components of distributed energy resources, such as PV inverters and the list of other equipment that Maurice had already addressed. If hacked, the DER output could be compromised in a way that disrupts the stability of the local distribution system. With the prevalence of DER deployed at federal sites or any government organization or any utility, like I had just said, ongoing initiative to enhance and ensure energy resilience, the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of DERs must be understood and addressed. Next slide. So as a result, NREL actually proposed an idea to Department of Energy a few years back. We actually at NREL have been conducting cybersecurity assessments for over 5 years now, and those assessments were originally based on the Department of Energy's Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, otherwise known as the C2M2, as well as the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And as a result, we've been conducting those assessments. We had decided that there was definitely a need for helping organizations be able to do self-assessments, be able to, be able to take these assessments on their own. And so we proposed an idea to DOE to go ahead and build an online tool, as well as an online resource document to go ahead and address cybersecurity for DERs. So like I said, there is both a guide and an online tool. This was published earlier this year. as well as we deployed an online tool. There's the PDF copy. Maurice has the hyperlink at the bottom of this slide, which I believe will be made available after this presentation. And it addresses some core cybersecurity concepts. We have some specific model pillars that we're addressing throughout the assessment with respective domains, and then also provide the references to those cybersecurity controls. This is just a picture of what the online tool looks like. So it's the login page. This is a publicly available interactive online tool, which means it's open source, free for anyone to use. And it is hosted at NREL, and it is www.dercf.nrel.gov. And it is a user-based focused assessment, meaning that anyone can go in and be able to take an assessment for an organization. But we do highly recommend that we have actually identified specific roles. Once you get into the tool, you'll see that we have a series of controls throughout the assessment process where we have identified specific people within the organization that need to be present or need to help address those specific cybersecurity controls, whether it's through workforce development, might be somebody in your human resources department, or it could be the chief engineer of a utility, or an energy manager at a government site location. This tool actually gives detailed results and action items as a result. So as you go through the process to take the assessment, at the end of the assessment, you will get a list of action items. We have created an algorithm on the back side of it that has a basic scoring system that is tied to specific action items, and based on criticality and maturity, the action items will be listed out in order of importance. The user base, obviously, like I said, is definitely site operations, energy managers, as well as executive managers. So this assessment actually tailors to individual sites, and we are currently working on building that out even more, where we'll be able to, you'll be able to go ahead and input specific DER devices and then have specific cybersecurity controls as they relate to those devices populate. Next slide.
And I'll jump in here and just say that based on Tammy's work with the DERCF and the online tool that you saw, we got a request from USAID to produce a fact sheet that kind of rolls up a lot of the ideas and concepts into just a several page document. So if you're looking for a quick start in the area of DER security that references a lot of the resources that we're talking about here today, this is a good place to start. And you can download that from the NREL website. There's both an English version and a Russian version. We got some interest from Russian-speaking countries, so went ahead and did a translation of that, and encourage you to check this out as a way of easing into this topic if you are unfamiliar with it. And this is a screenshot from the Dursa Tool. Tammy, you want to tell us what we're seeing here?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, when you log in initially, you will see this dashboard. Obviously, when you first start your first assessment, it'll be all zeros until you've went through the process of actually taking an assessment. This assessment is definitely dynamically driven, meaning that it's not just a basic spreadsheet type assessment where you go in and answer the questions. There are different types of questions, different types of answers, and then like I alluded to earlier about the algorithm on the backside, there is a scoring system that helps populate this dashboard so that you can get a really good idea of where you are with your cybersecurity posture for your DERs. This is definitely internally facing application to aid researchers based on their user behavior. So each individual's input is very critical to this. And one of the features actually that we're currently trying to build out is that if you go ahead and take an initial assessment, you will be able to create a baseline, and then therefore over time you will be able to then do some comparative analysis on your cybersecurity posture and how you're growing over an extended period of time, so that you can see the improvements that you've made. Make sure that you are addressing those critical areas that need to be addressed to make sure that you are as mature as you possibly can be. This is definitely a user experience focused application and encourages reuse. And this is all, there is an option for an anonymous version. So there is a data-driven version where there's data that's actually stored, and it is stored through the FIPS 199 medium standards, as well as an anonymous version. And then obviously also the PDF document available to anybody that might want to be taking an assessment. So the three key areas that we've identified for us taking an assessment are governance, technical management, as well as physical security. And in these key areas listed out here are the domains under each. And for instance, under the cyber governance security assessment, this is actually the types of assessments that we had been doing all along for the last 5 years. And those are based on the DOE C2M2 as well as the NIST cybersecurity framework. Those are the 10 domains in the C2M2 that are listed out there. And we didn't make any changes to what is out there. We just built it into the application so that you could be able to assess much easier with a user-friendly application to be able to take that assessment. But then we felt that there was definitely a need to build out a technical management assessment as well as a physical security assessment.
And I'll just jump in here to say that this webinar is part of a series, and if you saw the June 25th webinar that we did as part of this series, you'll know that I covered some of these domains, particularly in cyber governance, in the building blocks webinar. So we'll just quickly go through a couple of, or one example each from each of these columns to kind of dig in a little bit to show what each one covers, and then we'll turn it over to Curly Henry from Southern Company. So asset change and configuration management. Basically, this tries to get at what is running on your system in terms of hardware and software, what versions of the software you're running, and how do you know based on alerts about vulnerabilities of different devices, what's on your system and what is likely to be vulnerable at any time. It gets back to the security principle that if you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. So you have to have an awareness at all time of what state your device is in and where they are on your system. Account management, that's the control of who is accessing the different devices on your system, and how you make sure that you're enforcing the principle of least privilege, which is basically says that if someone doesn't have a reason to access a device, then they should not have the privilege or the access to do so, and making sure that you revoke access when it's no longer needed for a particular individual. And then administrative controls, those are the policies and the procedures that you use to guide the behavior of the humans in the loop and make sure that your staff are supporting your cyber cyber efforts rather than impeding them. So, Tammy, you want to give us the summary, and then we'll just briefly look at resources and turn things over to Curly?
Absolutely. So in summary, the DURSIF is a holistic tool for evaluating cybersecurity posture of any organization, utility, or a government site that might be integrating distributed energy resources onto the system or currently has DERs on their system. It's a networked grid. Devices are now being controlled by consumers or third parties who are not fully aware of the need for cybersecurity. The DURSIF offers a sharper focus on distributed energy technologies and greater emphasis on physical security and technical management. Users will be able to access the DURSIF guided assessment through a web-based application or downloadable document, which presents users with questions about security controls and practices that relate to their use of their DERs. And the DURSIF is a web application tool which generates a score, right? Like I showed the dashboard, based on the user's response that indicates their current state of the DER cybersecurity, and then also how they can improve that security.
Thank you, Tammy. And the resources that went into producing the Dursa tool are shown here. Those are links. So when you get the slides for this, you can click on those and access the different resources shown here. And as you can see, we drew a lot of information from a lot of different sources from the industrial control realm, risk assessment, security and privacies. As I showed on the Venn diagram, kind of a broad-based effort all going into the ER security. And then here's some other resources, the DURSIF tool itself and the fact sheet, and a couple of resources from our sister lab, Sandia National Lab, which provided some very good fundamental work on security for DER and helped inform our thinking. These are much longer documents and much bigger reads, so but they are very good. And then if you want to access the Building Blocks webinar from June 25th, there is a link for that on the Resilient Energy org website. I suggest everyone to go back, look at all the recordings from this series, and also register for the next one, which I think is July 16th. Yeah, July 16th, and encourage you to attend that as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Curly Henry from Southern Company. Curly, do you want to start with a brief introduction of yourself and then jump in?
Absolutely. Thanks, Maurice. Good day, everyone. My name is Curly Henry. I'm the Executive Director at Southern Company, responsible for strategy and architecture largely. And those include both the IT and enterprise network, as well as the OT networks. So the parts of our company that are responsible for running the grid, it's transmission, distribution, the metering and other elements. As of late, a growing component here is the DER presence in our environment and things that we're doing to leverage those solutions. And I'll spend the next few minutes kind of stepping through that. Make sure. Maurice, if you give it, there we go. All right. So from an agenda perspective, I'm going to step through, I'll talk about a background perspective, how a utility is thinking about this, kind of the focus areas as we adopt more distributed energy resources, cybersecurity approach, some of the characteristics and risk, and then just leave you with some considerations. Next slide. So from a focus perspective, our goal is to ensure that we securely monitor and control the operation of resources in large geographical areas by maintaining safety, reliability, and resiliency of the grid, especially as distributed energy resources expand rapidly. There's numerous reasons why there's a proliferation of DERs, and you can see a few of them here. Some of that is financial and business reasons. Think greater resiliency from a pure dollars perspective, a reduction in O&M with improved efficiencies, and more opportunities to leverage capital where that is advantageous. From a climate and technological imperatives perspective, this drive to adopt both low carbon approaches and low to no carbon approaches is really a motivator and push behind this. You've got entrepreneurship, the model that has been the case where larger entities, be it state government or large utilities, have the responsibility and ownership of providing power, kind of from beginning to end, soup to nuts, both from a generation perspective down to a distribution perspective. Well, the model is changing, right? And the entrepreneurship opportunities that are presenting themselves for startups and others to get into this space to be able to leverage some of the technology and be a power provider of sorts is another reason. And last but not least, the growing digitalization of the grid and everything else around us, and some of the technological efficiencies that provides. Next slide. So from a cybersecurity approach perspective, we go down a path, and I'll step through some of a roadmap mentality here. Next slide, methodology more. And what we have is essentially being able to model out the things that we're trying to accomplish. Those are the objectives and the capabilities all the way down through system requirements. And you step through each of those areas thinking through what exactly is it that we want to accomplish. In doing so, what are the capabilities that we need to be able to provide? Are we developing those capabilities, or are we leveraging someone else to develop those capabilities for us? That building blocks, something that Maurice referenced earlier that a previous webinar covered. I would highly encourage going back to reference that, but thinking through some of those building blocks. And then how do you implement? Next slide. To summarize that, the slide illustrates this walk, jog, run perspective. And for us, that is, from that first step, being able to minimize the risk, but maximize productivity and the benefits that we're able to gain. That second step is being able to effectively integrate from a secure perspective these renewables. And lastly, ensuring that there is a collaboration. Maurice mentioned earlier about the grid edge, right? So you've got the bulk power from a transmission distribution, and now these other elements that are on the edge of the grid that are now becoming a part of the grid. And in a lot of instances, as I referenced earlier, when I talked about entrepreneurship, that's not under a single control anymore by a state, a government, or a single utility. There's now more collaboration with different entities providing pieces and parts of that generation mix back to that grid. And how do you manage the impact and responsibilities now as you have to go through those integrations? One of the things that I would note here, as you start thinking about some of the future states, and some of that's outlined down below, is this constant theme of training. There's this component of ensuring that there's a high level of education and awareness of what this means. We look to make sure that people understand that cybersecurity isn't just the job of the person who has cyber in their title. Cybersecurity, from a risk perspective, becomes everyone's job. And that understanding and awareness helps ensure that situations like that Marie spoke of that occurred in Utah either lessens the probability of those things occurring, or if they occur, lessens the impact, because you just have a population of people who are more aware, both on the IT enterprise side as well as on the OT side, those that are grid operators and such. Next slide. I want to talk a bit here about the characteristics and risk for a moment or two. Next slide, please. So to expound upon what Maurice noted earlier, that and to give you this vantage point from a utility perspective, if you start over to the left, as you introduce more DERs to the system, you're not dealing with a single entity anymore, be it state government or a single utility, as I've mentioned a couple of times now. And with the multiple parties involved, you now have less centralized control. That inherently just introduces more unknown risk. The benefit, of course, is there's the adaptation and adaptation and adoption of these emerging technologies. You have inherently more solutions that are more connected, more intelligent, and more distributed. But as Maurice noted, I mean, as you're introducing these solutions and technologies to this system that's critical and vital for society, it's not coming with mandatory standards. And inherently, as you get these new players into the space, from that entrepreneurship perspective, their first thought is probably, how do we get a solution to market, right? And their first thought isn't, how do we get a secure solution to market? So there's less attention to the cybersecurity. And as I mentioned before, the security awareness, both from internal personnel, but also external personnel who are now more involved in providing power. And inherently, that just introduces more complexity. Without being very deliberate, there's the potential for more reported attacks. Small scale, large scale doesn't really matter. The introduction of more attacks inherently is just additional risk. Next slide, please. So with those characteristics and some of the risks that I just noted, you'll see where some of those concerns come in there at the bottom. You know, the increased attack vectors because of the additional landscape to cover, more potential compromisable devices and such. But the other view of that is, how can we get to a place where we're able to adopt and leverage what DERs can bring from a positive perspective that we've stepped through earlier, but reduce those risks. And that's stated here in some of this future state. Where can we go? And what are some of the things that we can drive towards? One of the things that we're really focused on is influence, right? Where can we influence the market to ensure that when devices come to us, that they were built with, security in mind? A secure by design posture will inherently reduce the risk for those who have to operate the grid. Where there's opportunities to influence regulations and standards, making sure that there's a clear common set of regulations around this. And then that training component again, that training and awareness, that constant focus in ensuring that people have an understanding of what these risks are from a cyber perspective and what it is that they can do from their job and their vantage point to reduce those risks. Next slide, please. Next slide. So here are a few considerations in approaching this, and they're largely around financial, regulatory, and governance. And I'll just, note that for each of these, you've got barriers, and then there's an approach to address those barriers. And then you can see here some of the recommendations. From a barriers perspective, on the financial side, there still isn't a mechanism or a means where cybersecurity investments, from a bottom line perspective, at the board level, it's clear what that return on investment is. From an approach perspective, being able to figure out ways to measure, report, and benchmark cybersecurity will encourage more investment. And some of the things that Tammy was talking about, both from a C2M2 perspective and an NREL perspective, from being able to leverage standard models to measure the effectiveness of what's occurring, and then being able to show that to others, both from a gaps perspective as well as opportunities to improve. That recommendation there, being able to evaluate the current risk management process, have an understanding of what that is today, find that North Star, find that place where you want to be, and then being able to track that progress and show that to those who have to make those investments. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thanks. There's a number of objectives that we're trying to drive to here, but at the end of the day, we want to be able to adapt these resources for all the benefits that have been spelled out earlier in this presentation. Secure integration of those resources is going to be key, and it's a strategic objective. Another thing I'll note is just that the understanding that there's going to need to be more collaboration, because there's just going to be more hands involved in providing this power to the grid and to the society, and understanding where those things come together is going to be important. From an actions perspective, develop and socialize that risk management framework. Make sure that there's clear understanding of and baseline where an organization is today, where the organization wants to go, and that those steps in between to get there. And last but not least, processes and training. Ensure that you're figuring out continuous ways, but clever ways, different ways to introduce security awareness and training for those who have these responsibilities, and come up with very clear incident report processes. Understand where your organization's responsibilities lie. If an incident was to occur, and where other groups, departments, and or other external entities' responsibilities come into play. If I can stress one thing before turning it over, having an incident response plan in advance of an incident is critically important. Being able to think through and understand whose responsibility and who needs to do what before an incident actually occurs can be the difference in a nominal impact of something occurring and a major impact. So be very intentional and diligent in taking the time to lay out those incident response plans. We'll turn it over now to James.
Yes, thank you, Curly, and thank you to Maurice and Tammy for the great, engaging, and informative presentations. This is James Ellsworth from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Resilient Energy Platform, and I will be moderating the question and answer section of the webinar. We already have lots of really good questions coming in, and I'll get to those. We'll get to those. If you do have other questions, I'll remind you to enter them in the webinar control panel. It's usually over to the right side of your screen, and there is a questions drop-down menu. You can type your questions in there, and then we will try to get to as many of them as possible. We will run, we'll stay on the line. We're getting towards the top of the hour, but we will go 5 to 10 minutes probably over the original scheduled time, just to make sure we can answer a lot of these good questions. And if we don't get to your questions during the webinar, we will try to reach out afterwards and give you individual responses to the email address that you registered with. So it's hard to choose with all these good questions coming in, but I'll kick it off with this one. The question is, there's something of a trend to install DER interface equipment, things such as PV inverters, battery packs, and grid interfaces, to install them on the exterior of buildings to ease installation and utility access and to minimize internal wiring issues. What cybersecurity issues does this raise and how can they be managed? So I'll imagine all of our presenters might be able to weigh in on this one. I'll kick it over to Maurice first, and then if Tammy or Curly want to weigh in, feel free to chime in and go for it.
Sure. I touched on this in my presentation, but it bears repeating, is that one of the truisms of cybersecurity is that if you can physically access something, you have a pretty good shot of compromising it from a cybersecurity perspective. And this applies to everything from your laptop computers. If I can grab your laptop computer, I can begin the process of hacking into it and getting at your data. And if these devices are connected to a network, these inverters and other power devices that the question references, if they're connected to the utility network and they're on the outside of a building, that enables me to walk up to it literally and look for access either through a USB port, or maybe I pry open the cover and begin accessing some of the internal components. But it's something that has to be thought about, and I understand the driver for wanting to mount these on the outside of buildings. The wiring, it's less of a installation burden, but that really has to be thought about and considered. And I'll turn it over to either Tammy or Curly to build on that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Maurice. So I just wanted to add that obviously physical security is a part of our assessment tool, which obviously will help identify essentially what risks you're willing to take, right? And I thank you, Curly, for your presentation and helping identify that risk management is absolutely a key area that needs to be addressed as well. Actually, that is what we have funding for this year from DOE to add to the Dursa tool, is a risk management framework overlay, which will help identify the risk and help identify specifically for physical security, whether it's going to be devices that are behind a gate, or if you're going to have video cameras, or if they're just out in the open, like Maurice had alluded to. So it's really all about risk, what risk you're willing to take, and what security then you need to put in place in order to secure those devices.
All right, so
yeah, this is Curly. I was just going to say, no, I think Tammy and Maurice both covered it well. Go ahead, James.
Great. So I'll send the next question to you then, Curly, because you mentioned in your presentation about the growing number of DERs coming online in your service area. This question is about what is the percentage of your utility operations that constitute DER? And I suppose you could take that a couple different ways in terms of the capacity on your system, or actually the number of generation assets.
Yeah, I'll go down the capacity path. We've seen a growth, considering there was a nominal amount several years ago. Southern Company vertically integrated, and we have true mix of all generation capabilities to include coal, nuclear, gas, but our generation mix has actually changed, and we're about 22% in DERs today, with a projected growth even over the next 3 years to be just below 50%. And then we've got some pretty aggressive targets to get to low to no carbon both by 2035 as well as by 2050.
That's great. We'll go to Tammy for, I think I've pulled together several questions on the Dursa tool. So I'll give you a few rapid fire questions if that's all right.
Sure.
The first one is the online tool available and usable for private sector installations or US government installations only?
It is open to all. So anyone, it's an open source tool that can be used by anyone.
Great. How relevant is this report and tool, report/guide/tool/knowledge? How relevant is that for other countries?
I believe it's extremely important, especially since the United States has obviously got a very robust cybersecurity national plan, and basically we have aligned ourselves with many of the NIST frameworks that have been put out, as well as DOE cybersecurity frameworks. That's what all of our research and this tool is based on, is through collective experience that our country has faced with cybersecurity breaches and issues, and so therefore we built out these frameworks that are very robust and help address cybersecurity for any country.
Okay, and then one more. Does the tool address both OT and IoT devices rather than just IoT?
Yes, absolutely, and that's a great question. I think Maurice and I have conducted over 30 assessments for utilities across the country, and we had actually recommended at the time to go ahead and do 2 different assessments, one for IT and one for OT, and that's definitely something that can be addressed here. But the Dursa tool actually will help integrate both of those 2 sides of an organization to help address all of the cybersecurity issues for IT and for OT.
Great, thanks. And if you need the link for the tool, that will be in the slides for this webinar, which will be available and posted on the Resilient Energy Platform and the USEA website after the webinar concludes. All right, so next question, I think we'll go to Curly with this one. A hypothetical scenario: if you were a CEO of a utility in country X, but you had limited resources, but your government issued tender for up to a certain percentage of installed capacity in renewable energy, what would you do to reduce the risks?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. When we talk about grid edge, and then the grid edge being the end of what utilities or governments or states that have control of the utility operations typically have, there is this changing dynamic where essentially consumers of energy, that's just pure customers, have the ability now to become prosumers. They actually have the ability, when we start talking about battery storage, when we start talking about solar power in residential neighborhoods and on homes, they have the ability to be producers of energy and provide that back for the whole. I think a focus would be around segmentation and micro segmentation as a focus area to reduce those risks, right? If utilities become more platforms of such for brokering the transaction of energy, right? They produce some, but others, other entities, maybe consumers from a prosumer perspective, have the ability to produce that and add that back. If you think of the utility now as being the centralized platform for brokering what goes on and what goes off and when it goes, the ability to segment and or micro segment probably becomes one of the focus areas. It's not a primary, probably top 2 or 3, in an effort to reduce that risk, to my company from a CEO perspective.
All right, thanks. Quick question here for Maurice. You mentioned the attack in Utah. What was the impact of that attack? You mentioned that there was a lost connection to the generation installations, but was there a blackout or any kind of customer side effects from that attack?
I don't think there was a blackout. Basically, it was the loss of communication. So for a time, the company, I believe, didn't have insight into what their equipment was doing, whether it was still online. Not 100% sure of the full impact, but generally that's as it was reported as being a communication loss. That's what you experience during a communication loss. So during that time, if they had an outage, they might not have known it or might not have been able to restore as quickly or effectively as they would otherwise. So fairly low impact, but I think the point is that just how with that many devices being added to the system and exposed possibly to public communication channels like the internet, you really need to think about how those are secured and how you keep up to date with security measures. I mean, basically it was an unpatched firewall, so that falls within the domain that I mentioned during my presentation about asset management and change management. More robust asset management would have corrected that. But low impact is the short answer.
Great. Now we'll do a couple more questions online here, and then whatever we don't get to, we will try to reach out individually and respond to your questions over email. So let's go with this one. Can or could also suppose, could a hacker affect the entire grid, including the connected generation system, through a cyber attack on a DER? I don't know, Maurice, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. When you say the entire grid, generally speaking, the grid is, the utilities that are operating the grid are their own kind of, for cybersecurity purposes, their own island. You could, as I mentioned, do an upstream attack, which begins by compromising a DER, possibly walking up and sticking a thumb drive into a USB port, and from there move upstream into the SCADA system, and possibly from there into the utility enterprise network. So you could, I would say, it's certainly possible to affect something utility-wide from a DER. Whether you could extend it beyond that, it kind of depends on the connectivity between the utility and other entities. Generally, utilities are standalone, but I think one thing that you could do, and I mentioned this as well, is look for ways to compromise large devices across different utilities by attacking the vendor of those utilities, either inserting malware during the manufacturing process or during the software update process, and both of those might have impact. And the impact scales with the deployment of DERs. I mean, Curly mentioned some very aggressive renewable objectives for Southern Company, which is great. But you have to think as that percentage of renewable generation goes up, so does the potential for mischief and disruptive activities if those facilities were compromised. So that speaks to the point he made about risk management and assessing the risk to your system.
Great. Thanks. Next question says, is there a dedicated electronic cybersecurity reporting platform where victims can log on and report a cybercrime?
There are. It kind of depends on the nature of the cybercrime. In the United States and in Europe, there are regulations in place that require you to report the loss of what they call PII, personal identifiable information. So think of your credit card, your home address, and certain personal details about you that might be interesting to criminals. The trigger for these are different in different nations. In other words, are in different areas. How many records are lost and under what circumstances kind of triggers whether or not they need to be reported. In the utility space, the way that the U.S. regulations are set up, NREL, it's kind of self-reporting. If you have an incident, you are expected to let the regulators know about that so that they can, both work with you and to remediate the situation, and also assess whether any fines need to be imposed. So there are a whole. The answer to the question is there are a whole host of laws and regulations around cyber attack. In terms of reporting, it depends on the nature of the attack. If it's whether it would go to law enforcement. In other words, would you work with here in the U.S., it would be the FBI. Each nation will have its own kind of law enforcement entity to address different crimes. But there are also organizations that exist simply to share information about cyber attacks and to inform other entities. And those, I provide a list of those in my previous webinar on the building blocks. So I refer folks to go back to that webinar and check out the links that are provided there.
Great. We'll take this as one last question, as it's particularly relevant to these times. And it's about COVID-19. And if you have any advice on how to handle the different or increased risks due to people working from home.
That's a tough one. And if you've been following the news, you know that hackers are creatures of opportunity, and this is a new opportunity for them. The fact that people are working from home, using their home networks to connect to their work networks, how secure are those home networks? If you can get into them, can you establish some kind of presence that allows you to monitor what you're doing and perhaps capture credentials? I don't have any recommendations on how to address that, other than number one, all employees should follow their employer's recommended practices for security. In other words, if your IT department is telling you to do something a different way and not use certain applications, follow those instructions. We have that here at NREL. We've been told not to use certain meeting applications because they have not reached, because their security has not been vetted for use by federal facilities. They're not necessarily secure, but they haven't been vetted. So I've had to find workarounds for that in order to be compliant, but emphasize to your employees the importance of following the new rules that are coming out and probably evolving in real time around working from home. The other one is encourage everyone who is working from home to learn more about best practices for securing their home area networks and implementing those. And I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say that everyone who's working from home could probably do a better job of and take one more look at their home area network. So I'd encourage everyone to do that who's on this call, whether they're going into the office or not. It's a good way to increase your own personal security space, as well as providing more security for your employer.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Maurice and Tammy and Curly, for answering the questions and for the great presentations. Again, we had many questions come in, and we were not able to get to them all. We are expanding the cyber resources on the Resilient Energy platform. So if you do not get your question answered, you might be able to head over to the website there and find some answers to your questions. There's lots of fact sheets, other publications, and tools such as the Dursa tool that you can access through the website there. We also have recordings. We'll have a recording of this webinar and of the building blocks webinar that we gave 2 weeks ago, which you can rewatch and maybe get some of the answers to your questions there, or just learn more about the topic in general. Otherwise, we will try to reach out individually and answer your questions if we did not get to them via the email you registered with the webinar. All right, so with that, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you all for staying on past our originally scheduled time. And I'll hand it back over to Jeremy Foster for some closing remarks. If Jeremy's still on the line. All right, well, I'll take it from here then. I'll invite everyone who's listening now to tune in for the next webinar in this series. It will be in a week on July 16th. It's titled The Corporate Culture and Importance of Cyber Hygiene. That will be the last of the 5 webinars in this series presented by USEA. Otherwise, before we go, we'd like to invite you to keep in touch by following NREL on LinkedIn or Twitter, and to join the USAID NREL partnership mailing list. You can access through the link listed on this slide. Otherwise, thank you all for tuning in and attending. This webinar and the slides will be emailed out to all attendees when it's ready after the webinar, and will also be posted on the Resilient Energy platform. Otherwise, thank you all again. Stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.